Amen. Okay, so we've been talking the last couple of weeks, and we're going to continue talking about the second coming of Christ. And again, this can be a very complex subject. We're, in just 4-hour sessions here, we're not going to hit, or 3-hour sessions, however long we go. We're not going to hit everything. So some of you'll just have to say, okay, I'll accept it. But I also don't want us to get so bogged down in the details that we really miss the big picture. So try to, let's occasionally say time out, let's look at the big picture, because that's a really important thing to take out. I also was thinking about how to do today. So today we're really going to talk about a bunch of timelines and things like that. As a matter of fact, I'll do my first one here. I have a timeline. This is sort of the conventional, most of you are probably familiar with this, okay? It says, I don't know how well you can read it, it says church age, tribulation, millennium, and eternity. You've all heard those words before, right? At least if you hang around here very, well, the first thing you'll notice is, well, Brother Steve, we're rather low-tech today. And the answer is, that's intentional. I thought about having a bunch of fancy graphics on the screen, and certainly our tech guys can take care of that stuff. And I thought, no, for this particular topic, we're gonna go back old school. We're gonna do Sharpies and poster board. So I have a bunch of Sharpie and poster board things here just to be a little bit different, and so you'll enjoy it. And so I put up, this is sort of our standard end times timeline. And most of you have probably run into this before. The question is, where did this come from? Well, it came from the Bible. Linda's saying, yeah, I hope so. That's not at all obvious. But it's also not obvious even if you pick up your Bible, because there's no one place in the Bible that really spells out exactly this, but there's lots of different places. And that's sort of where we're going to go through some. We're going to sort of do the timeline idea today. We're not going to spend as much time talking about some of the details of what happens in the tribulation, what happens in the millennium, what happens in eternity. We're going to tackle that next week, okay? So today, not exclusively, but a little bit, we're going to focus sort of on the timing of things, and then the details a little bit more about what's actually happening. We'll go into a little bit more in depth. And so where would we go in the Bible to find that stuff? This is a trick question, actually.
Daniel's one of them.
Daniel, turns out, the first answer, you would probably say Revelation, right? Well, it turns out Revelation gives us a lot of the details, mostly about what happens in this thing we call the tribulation. And that's what 18 chapters of Revelation or so is really about that tribulation period time. And it gives you a couple chapters about what happens at the end, and a couple of chapters about some general introductory stuff at the beginning. And but it doesn't really talk a lot about the timeline itself. We have to go elsewhere, and ironically, we have to go to the Old Testament, the book of Daniel, to really build up. There's some other verses that we may need to, Joel and Ezra and some other places, but it's primarily the book of Daniel that spells out what we need to know to put together this end times timeline. Does that make sense? Well, I don't know if it makes sense, but that's the way God gave it to us. Okay, and but we all copying. And last week, of course, we talked about fulfilled prophecy. This is where I wish Ronnie was here, because the book of Daniel was written a long time ago. We'll talk about just how long ago. And a bunch of what Daniel wrote most of it was prophecy. Some of it was prophecy that has already been fulfilled. And some of it is prophecy that is still to be fulfilled. And when we track through all that, that's how we're going to end up with this kind of timeline, because this is sort of that still to be filled part. Make sense? Everybody nodding your heads? Tracking so far? So let's, so we're going to primarily look at Daniel today. So let's, and you may, if you want, you can have your Bible and follow along in Daniel. I'll read a few verses, and then there's a lot I'll just sort of summarize, because we don't want to have to read the entire book of Daniel tonight. We want to get out at a reasonable time. But before we even do that, let's think about the book of Daniel, when it was written, who was it written by, things like that. We'll start with an easy question. Who wrote the book of Daniel? Daniel did, right? Or at least it's his narrative. When was it written?
While they were in captivity.
While they were in captivity. So we're going to have to explain for a few minutes what that means. Okay? And we'll come back to that in just a second. But we got to sort of build on that, because understanding the context of who Daniel was and when he was writing and what was going on around him is going to be important to establishing this timeline we want to go. What does Daniel talk about? Anybody ever done an in-depth study of the book of Daniel? It's a bunch of accounts, mostly, and a few of the stories we're really familiar with. Daniel in the lion's den, right? And that's that's some of the stuff we're not going to touch. And the 3 Israeli boys that were thrown into the furnace and all of that, that's all in Daniel. But the rest of Daniel is all about some visions that were given, primarily given to Daniel. And we're going to start out with another vision that Daniel interpreted, wasn't given to him. That will really, these visions contain the prophecies. And when you first look at the visions, when you first look at them, they're pretty wild stuff. But when you actually sit down and break them down, you can sort of figure them out, and they really make sense. And that's what will help us build our timeline. One other thing about the book of Daniel to keep in mind is that it has a first chapter that has a bunch of biographical stuff in it. But then it has, and we're not going to go through all that. This would take us way too long if we went through all of Daniel in detail. But chapters 2 through 7 are really focused on the prophetic plan for the Gentiles, for the nations around Israel. And the chapters 8 through 12 really focus on Israel. Now, not to the exclusion of each other. Obviously, there's some overlap, but that's something to keep in mind. And interestingly, 2 through 7 is actually written, was originally written in Aramaic, and 8 through 12 was originally written in Hebrew. So the part written about the prophetic plan for Israel was written in Hebrew. The prophetic plan for the Gentile nations was written in Aramaic, which is one of the languages used by the surrounding nations. So, okay, so what's going on in the time period that Daniel was writing? First of all, do we have a date? Yeah, it turns out to be around the 7th century. Daniel was born roughly, we don't have an exact date, but roughly 600 BC. And then it continues all through the 5-something BC and throughout his life. So that's the time period we're talking about. What was going on then? Angela started taking us down this path. What was going on as we roll into the 7th century, as we run into 600 BC? What was going on?
The Babylonians had taken the children of Israel captive.
As a matter of fact, we'll roll it back just a little bit further than that. Before the Babylonians were the Assyrians. Here's my first big chart. Assyria. There you go, Assyria. They were the world power of the time. This is what we call the Neo-Assyrian Empire. And it really came about as being the world power sometime around 900 BC or so. And in the Middle East region, they were the kings. They were the bad dudes, by the way, too. These were pretty ruthless people. Like they had essentially threshing machines that they would drive by using horses and just scoop by people and mash them up and stuff. They were just totally brutal people. But God used the Assyrians as a vehicle to chastise the nation of Israel. If you remember, we don't want to delve too much time into our nation of Israel study, but after David and Solomon, Israel divided into 2 different kingdoms, a northern kingdom and a southern kingdom. And in 721, the northern kingdom had succumbed to the Assyrian army. Assyria had essentially overtaken them and hauled them off into captivity and things like that. That was consisted of the northern tribes. And the southern tribes managed to survive that, managed to escape it. You go back and read about Hezekiah and that story. And that sort of brings us up right up to the point of where we are. Around 600 BC, Babylonia was arising to be the world power. And it was actually about 612 BC. So there we go, 612 BC, that they actually overthrew Nineveh, the capital of Assyria, and replaced the Assyrians as the big world power of the time. So as Daniel's writing, Babylonia is ascending and is soon to become the world power. Daniel gets captured in 604 BC. He was an Israelite, him and a bunch of young lads, as the Babylonians came in their wars against Nineveh and everyone else. They took a bunch of them, took them back to Babylon, the capital of Babylonia, and made them, they were essentially trying to integrate them into society, and that's and that's where you get Daniel's in the lion den and all those other stories. And their king was Nebuchadnezzar, and it was probably about 604 BC when Daniel is taken. And so this first episode we're going to talk about right now in Daniel chapter 2 is right after Daniel was captured and brought in, and again, it's right as Babylon was about to defeat the Assyrians, about to invade Nineveh and become the world power. And so Nebuchadnezzar, the king, has a dream. The king of Babylon has a dream, and he can't figure out the dream. He calls all of his advisors in, and he says, "Advisors, tell me the dream, how to interpret this dream." And they all say, "Sure, tell us the dream." And Nebuchadnezzar says, "No, that's too easy. You could just tell me anything. Why don't you tell me the dream and then tell me the interpretation of the dream?" And they said, "Well, we can't tell you the interpretation of the dream unless you tell us the dream." And so Nebuchadnezzar says, "Well, you guys aren't much use, are you?" And so Daniel hears about this, and Daniel prays, and God gives Daniel the dream and the interpretation of the dream. So that's the setting here for what's happening in Daniel chapter 2. Everybody got it? So what is the picture, the dream that Nebuchadnezzar had that Daniel now interprets? So it goes all through chapter 2. We won't read it all, but here's Daniel speaking back to Nebuchadnezzar about what the dream was. I didn't write down just which verse it was, but it says, "Thou, O king, sawest and behold, a great image. This great image, whose brightness was excellent, stood before thee, and the form thereof was terrible. This image's head was of fine gold, his breast and his arms of silver, his belly and his thighs of brass, his legs of iron, his feet part of iron and part of clay." Got the picture? The dream was about this big image that was gold and silver, and it was gold up here, silver, brass, and then clay and iron in the legs. Pretty wild dream. And then something happened. Thou sawest till that a stone was cut out without hands, which smote the image upon his feet that were of iron and clay, and brake them to pieces. Then was the iron, the clay, the brass, the silver, and the gold broken to pieces together, and became like the chaff of summer threshing floors. And the wind carried them away, that no place was found for them. And the stone that smote the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. Okay, so that's the dream. And Daniel says, and now here's your interpretation of the dream. So he explains to him that each of those different metals they saw in this image were different kingdoms, starting with you, Nebuchadnezzar, and Babylon is the head of gold. Now, if you just stop right there, this would be good news for Nebuchadnezzar, right? And you would say it didn't take a genius. Daniel didn't have to be a genius to figure out that Babylon was taking over the world here. But he doesn't stop there. He says, wait a minute. There are still kingdoms to the future of you that will replace you. So the Babylon, which was head of gold, and they became the dominant power shortly after this dream when they defeated the Assyrians between 626 and 606 BC, and the fall of Nineveh we talked about was sort of 612 BC is the actual date that we sort of think about that. But that's going to be replaced by another. And the next one is the actual Medo-Persian Empire. So I have the Medo-Persian Empire. There we go, and nice high tech. And so in 536 BC, the Medo-Persians, led by a general by the name of Cyrus, they become the dominant power. And in 536, they actually defeat the forces. Nebuchadnezzar's gone by then, but they defeat the Babylonian forces, and they become the world power. And that's the end. Cyrus the Great is the leader. He takes care of it. He's going to be an important character for other reasons. But that's the Medo-Persian Empire. But the image doesn't stop there, right? What comes next? You have the head, and then the silver, and then the brass. Well, the brass turns out to be Greece. The Greco Empire, which 331 is generally the date given for when they become the dominant world power. Under Alexander the Great, 331 BC, Alexander the Great wins a famous battle. Let's see if I wrote down the name of it. He defeated the Medo-Persians in 331 BC. By the way, he dies the next year, and his empire is divided into 4 pieces. He has 4 generals, and they break up the different parts of the empire. But that's not the end, right? What happens? The Romans come along. 146 BC is a good date for the Roman Empire as becoming the world power. They actually defeat the Greeks in the Battle of Corinth in 146 BC, and that's the legs and feet of iron and clay. We didn't talk about the toes so much, but they in what we read, but he does mention the toes as well. How many toes do images have? 10 toes. So there's 10 toes, and that'll turn out to be important next week. Okay? So all this is being predicted by Daniel here in 605, 603, 602 BC, something like that. Well, what happens to the Roman Empire? It dissolves. When does it dissolve? Well, it's hard to give an exact date because it just sort of fell apart. But they were the world power in the time of Jesus, right? So as we study all through, through the New Testament, we know that Rome was the main power, and we have the run-ins that Jesus has with the Roman authorities, and then with Paul with the Roman authorities and all that kind of stuff. They were still the dominant world power at that time. A pretty good number is 476 BC. 476 476 AD. Okay, and that's when 476 is when, make sure I get their names right, they would appreciate that. The Roman Empire eventually fell apart, but it's difficult to give a single date. The most commonly cited date is about 476 AD when the Germanic leader Odoacer deposed the Roman Emperor Romulus Augustulus. Okay, so Odoacer beats Hun Visigoth, Ostrogoth, I guess, defeats the Roman Empire, and the Roman Empire has pretty much fallen into ruins at that time. And around 476 AD. So, how are we doing? Let's put this timeline sort of together. That's this chart. I just wrote down those 4 things we just wrote down. Babylonian Empire, again, real high-tech stuff here, okay? Babylon, Medo-Persian Empire, the Greece, and then Rome, and then what? Well, there was another part of the vision that he had in chapter 2, right? Let's go back and read that again. Thou sawest till that a stone was cut without hands, which smote the image upon his feet that were of iron and clay, and brake them to pieces. And then was the iron, the clay, the brass, and the silver, and the gold broken to pieces together, and became like the chaff of the summer threshing floors, and the wind carried them away, that no place was found for them. And the stone that smote the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. Oh, so we got one more kingdom. We've had 4 kingdoms now. We got one more kingdom. Let's for now call that the Great Mountain Kingdom, because that's how it describes it. It says that there's a stone that had not been cut by hand, and then it grows into a great mountain. Well, what is that? Well, and how are we going to put it on our timeline? Well, our temptation would be to sort of stick it right there at the end of the Roman Empire, right? Roman Empire falls at 476 AD. We'll just stick the Great Mountain right there. And what special thing happened in 476 BC? Nothing. There was no special empire or anything that took the place of the Roman Empire. We will enter into what we call the Middle Ages, or sometimes called the Dark Ages. That was most notable by the lack of a world power at the time. Well, what is this great kingdom then? This great mountain? Well, what might be your guess as to what it is? What's that sound like? Heaven? Close. Well, who would be the stone not cut by hand? Who do you think that might be a reference to? I sort of gave it away when I said who. Don't be bashful. Somebody yell it out. Jesus. We know it as Jesus. Now, obviously, Daniel doesn't know it as Jesus, but we're going to see this again later. So if you're saying, well, you might be stretching a little bit, well, we got some more visions coming up that'll make this more solid. We're just spending most of our time with this first vision. This is a messianic prophecy in which he's saying that there is a coming kingdom, God's kingdom, brought to us by a Messiah. And what's that kingdom going to do compared to the other kingdoms? It's going to break them apart, right? It says it's going to smash them to little bitty pieces, and they're just going to blow away in the wind. So there's a coming kingdom brought on by the stone that was not cut by hand, that grows into a great mountain, and that great mountain represents a coming kingdom. Is that what happened in 476 AD? No, nothing really happened. So, but on the other hand, so what's going on here? Well, here's sort of the way that we figure this out, and this will become clearer as we start looking at the other ones, but just so that we got it all in mind at the beginning. We have a gap. We have a gap there in the Roman period that will eventually end with the return of Christ and the establishment of the millennial kingdom. That's that great mountain. So I drew that like this. Okay? Here we are sometime at the Roman period. Now, is the Roman Empire around now? Well, certainly not explicitly. There's no, we have no Caesar, Augustus ruling the world or anything like that. So the way that we believe what the scriptures are referring to is that there's a period of time here that Daniel did not see. For reasons, we won't get into all the reasons, but basically because Daniel's focused upon Israel. Even in this part about, that he's talking about the Gentile nations, he's really focused on Israel. And this is a time in which Israel is not at the forefront of God's plan. We call that the church age. So stuck here in the middle of this Roman period is what we would call the church age. Well, when did that church end? We'll just use that as a loose term here. There's lots of things involved in that. When did the church age start? When did churches start? Roughly 300 AD, right? With Christ's first advent. When Jesus was here, he established his churches. And we've had churches all along for the last 2,000 years. And so we have this block of time that started somewhere around 33 AD. And we won't get into arguments about exactly when it started. Some people say 33, some people say 70 AD for reasons that we'll get in here. But for now, we don't really care about the exact date. We want to get the big picture. And so at some point, the church age is going to end. But we still need a Roman Empire, right? So because that's what the stone is going to crush. So we need a restored Roman Empire. Roman Empire isn't around now, but we're in this interlude, this church age interlude. At some point we're going to have a restored Roman Empire that'll look and feel sort of like the old Roman Empire. And that's what will be destroyed at the coming of the Messiah to establish the millennial kingdom. Everybody track it? Okay? Questions? We're good? Okay. That is one of the visions that Daniel had. There's a whole bunch more, and we're not going to go through them all. But we're going to talk a little bit about what happens in chapter 4. Because in chapter 4 he gets another vision that actually sort of parallels that one in chapter 2. The imagery is different, but the talk is very similar. How, what's being revealed through this symbolism. It starts out with, rather than seeing this image, and this is an actual vision that Daniel sees, he sees 4 beasts. The first beast is a lion with eagle's wings, and it's given a man's heart. And we identify that with the Babylonian Empire. The second one is a bear on its side with 3 ribs in its mouth, devouring flesh. And that's the Medo-Persian Empire. The next beast that he sees in chapter 7, did I say 8? This is in chapter 7. He sees a leopard with 4 wings and 4 heads. And it's given dominion. We see that as the Greek Empire. By the way, that 4 heads is important. What did I say happened when Alexander the Great took over in 331 BC? Took over, became king of the world, emperor of the world, all powerful one. And what happens? He keels over and dies the next year. He was replaced by 4 guys, and they broke the kingdom up into 4 parts. This beast has 4 heads. And then we get to the Roman Empire, a beast with 10 horns and teeth of iron, and it devoured, broke things in pieces, and stomped. And then it gets to an image, we're not going to go through all the imagery, it'll take us too long, but of the Son of Man and the Ancient of Days. And there's some imagery there associating that with the coming Messiah. And so that's the Masonic age. We'll nibble on some of the imagery given here next week when we go through some of the details, but it's sort of worth pointing out. You got 10 kings, which corresponds in Daniel 7, which corresponds to the 10 kings in the 10 toes in Daniel chapter 2. And some things, there's a whole bunch of other things. I will read one part of it. It says, I consider the horns, and behold, there came up among them another little horn, before whom there were 3 of the first horns plucked up by the roots, and behold, in this horn were eyes like the eyes of man, and a mouth speaking great things. And the 10 horns out of this kingdom are 10 kings that shall arise, and another shall rise after them. So there's going to be 10 kings. This is referring to Rome, and then another one is going to come up after them, and he shall be diverse from the first, and he shall subdue 3 kings. And he shall speak great words against the Most High, and shall he shall wear out the saints of the Most High, and think to change times and laws, and they shall be given into his hand until a time and times and a dividing of time. We get a phrase that we're not going to deal with today. Maybe we'll talk about this next week. Time, times, and dividing of time. Time, times, and dividing of time. Actually sounds like 3.5. Time, times, and dividing of time represents 3.5. But this is our first run-in Daniel of a character that we call the Antichrist. We're not going to get into the details now. We'll talk a little bit about that next week. But that's smack dab in the middle of this tribulation period, or in this as we come along. Okay, does that make sense? We're not going to go into any details on that, because we got another vision to tackle. This is in chapter 8. Daniel's having so many visions, you just feel like saying, Daniel, lay off the pizza before bedtime or something. You're just getting all these wild dreams. They're not really dreams the way we think of dreams. These are visions that he's being given. And so this one's sort of weird. Of course, the other ones were pretty weird too. But the angel Gabriel shows up to help him understand it, which is a convenient thing to do. Don't you wish every time you didn't understand something, Gabriel showed up and explained it to you? But he introduces a bunch of characters, including 8, verse 3 and 4 says, a ram which had 2 horns, and the 2 horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the higher one came up last. I saw the ram pushing westward and northward and southward, that no beast might stand before him. Neither was there any that should deliver out of his hand, but he did according to his will and became great. We believe that to be the Medo-Persian Empire. I've sort of skated around the Medo-Persian Empire, but it was originally the Medes were one people. They were allied with the Persians, but the Medes were the powerful one. And then over time, the Persians sort of overtook the Medes as the more powerful people in the ally, in the alliance. And so this is a reference to the Medo-Persian Empire. But we don't have to wonder about that, because in verse 20 it says, the ram which thou sawest having 2 horns are the kings of Media and Persia. Now, when did Media-Persia Empire last? I got a nice little picture to remind you. Medo-Persian Empire was between 536 and 331 BC. When's Daniel writing this stuff? Well, before then. He's calling them out by name. How do you know to call them out by name? Whoa. Matter of fact, he not only called them out by name, he even got the fact that first it was the Medes were the stronger one, and then eventually the Persians, and So he's calling this out hundreds of years before it happened. And then in 8:5 it says, and a he-goat came from the west on the face of the whole earth and touched not the ground, and the goat had a notable horn between his eyes. The rough goat is the king of Greece. That's Alexander the Great. And the great horn that was between his eyes is the first king. Who would that be? Alexander the Great. Again, now he's writing this hundreds of years before it actually happened. And so the man and the ram and the goat have this manly man contest. They start butting heads, and the goat destroys the ram. And this prophecy was fulfilled when the Persian Empire was conquered by the Alexander the Great in 331 BC. And right after Alexander's the Great's victory there, he dies, and his empire breaks into 4 parts, and he described that. And then we return to the goat with the broken head in verses Daniel 8:23 to 25. And in the latter time of their kingdom, when the transgressors are come to the full, a king of fierce countenance and understanding dark sentences shall stand up, and his power shall be mighty, but not by his own power, and he shall destroy wonderfully, and shall prosper and practice, and shall destroy the mighty and the holy people. And through his policy also he shall cause craft to prosper in his hand, and he shall magnify himself in his heart, and by peace shall destroy many. He shall also stand up against the prince of princes, but he shall be broken without hand. Who's that a reference to? That's a reference. You would expect it to be Rome, right? Because you just went Medo-Persian, Greece, Rome. But that doesn't really fit any Roman Empire. That's the coming Antichrist who's head of this restored Roman Empire. Okay. So we at a high level, we went through a bunch of the prophecies. There's some other prophecies that Daniel had that we got to tackle with, because they're going to establish a timeline from a different direction. So about this time, Daniel's probably wondering, well, how do the Jews fit into this? Remember where the Jews are now when Daniel is alive. They've been taken away into captivity. But the Assyrians had captured some of them, and then Nebuchadnezzar came along and captured the rest of them. And when Nebuchadnezzar came in 586, he destroys Jerusalem. He destroys the temple. Remember the temple that David had gotten the stuff for and Solomon had built? So the Babylonians in 586 destroyed Jerusalem, destroyed the temple. Daniel's back in Babylonia, the capital, lamenting that all this is happening. And this has now all happened, and he's sitting there wondering, well, how does Israel fit in all this? Remember, he's got he knows of all the prophecies about that the Israelites as God's people, and God will never abandon them, and things like that. And this certainly seems to be the darkest moments. And he's probably reflecting, if you go back to, here's where we're going to pull in a few more verses. Jeremiah talks about this. Jeremiah 25:11 to 13 says, and this whole land shall be desolate and an astonishment, and these nations shall serve the king of Babylon 70 years. Well, Daniel, when he reads this, gets his calendar out, his calculator, and he starts counting years, and he says, well, I was a young lad, and now I'm an old lad, and the 70 years is about up. What's going to happen, Lord? And it shall come to pass when 70 years are accomplished that I will punish the king of Babylon and that nation, saith the Lord, for their iniquity in the land of the Chaldeans. And I will make it perpetual desolations. God's going to come in and wipe out the Babylonians. And I will bring upon that land all my words which I have pronounced against it, even all that is written in this book which Jeremiah hath prophesied against all the nations. There's a whole lot of other prophecies in Jeremiah we won't cover. For thus saith the Lord, that after 70 years be accomplished at Babylon, I will visit you and perform my good word toward you in causing you to return to this place. So, Daniel's looking at his watch, maybe at his calendar, and saying, 70 years is about up. It's about time that we're going to get to go back to where we were. And But he wants to understand this in more detail. So he does what any one of us would do when we're faced with something like this. He put on sackcloth and ashes and started fasting, and he goes to the Lord and he petitions the Lord in prayer. That's what you guys would do, right? If you had these kinds of dreams. Well, maybe we should, but that is, he wants to show that he confesses his own sin, the sins of his people, Israel. He pleads for God's mercy and asks for understanding. And then to his astonishment, the angel Gabriel shows up and gives him some insights. So, Daniel 9:24, he sort of gets the answer to his question. He says, 70 weeks are determined upon thy people and upon thy holy city to finish the transgression and to make the end of sins, and to make reconciliation for iniquity, and to bring in everlasting righteousness, and to seal up the vision and the prophecy, and to anoint the most holy. Okay, we got a lot of words there. We're going to have to come back to it, but let's continue reading. It says, know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the commandment to restore and to build Jerusalem unto the Messiah, the Prince, shall be 7 weeks, and 62 weeks. The streets shall be built again, and the wall, even in troublous times. And after 62 weeks shall Messiah be cut off, but not for himself. And the people of the Prince that shall come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. And the end thereof shall be with a flood. And unto the end of the war desolations are determined. And he shall conform the covenant with many for 1 week, and in the midst of the week he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease, and for the overspreading of abomination he shall make it desolate, even until the condemnation that determined shall be poured upon the desolate. There's a lot to unpack there, and we're not going to unpack it all tonight. Much too much to unpack tonight, but we do want to get a couple of things. The first thing is he keeps mentioning a phrase that we gotta work with. It goes back and says 7 weeks and 62 weeks. Well, how much is 62? 62. So we have 7 and 7 weeks, 62 weeks, and then 1 week. And we have some things happening in each of those time frames. How do we understand that phrase? Well, it turns out not the way that we as English speakers would really understand it. The word that's translated week there doesn't necessarily imply 7 days. It implies, the word actually refers to, I forget the Hebrew word, but it's the word that implies a group of 7. So what he has is 70 groups of 7. And we understand those groups of 7 to actually refer to years. So we have a period of time here of 490 years. 7 groups of 7. And again, there's one group and another group. We're not going to get into the difference between those. But we have 69 years. And then 69 weeks. And again, weeks in air quote here because it's really 7 years. And then 1 week, 7 years. So we have 693 years, 483 years, excuse me. Can't do math in my head. 483 years, and then 7 years. Oh gosh, if only I'd written a chart out that says that. Here we go. Another high-tech chart that says, and you may have trouble reading it in the back there. You may not. I don't know. But it says, in this period of time that was just described to Daniel, there's going to be 490 years. 77 times 70, right? 70 groups of 7. Broken into 2 parts. And we're going to have to think about what's the beginning, what's the end, and what's the breakage. Well, what's it say in the first part, in 9:25 there? From the going forth of the commandment to restore. Well, what would that be? Well, remember, they are in captivity. And what he's been praying about and thinking about and researching in Jeremiah and some of the other books is how they're going to get back to rebuild the temple, rebuild the city so that God can bless them and they can, do their thing. And Daniel says, God, through Gabriel, says, don't worry, Daniel, there's going to be a command to restore. Not only is that coming, but that's going to start a timeline that's going to end with the Messiah coming and establishing the kingdom. So there's going to be a period of 490 years from the time in which there's the kingdom is established from the command to go restore. Everybody tracking? Tracking? You're saying, yeah, that sort of makes sense, except it doesn't track with anything in my history book, does it? Well, we got one other thing that happens in the middle. And in the middle there, it says, after 62 weeks, shall Messiah be cut off, but not for himself. So we have Messiah being cut off, and it talks about the city and sanctuary being destroyed. Well, you can tell right now, Daniel's blowing his mind, right? He's saying, well, if in the middle of it, the city and the sanctuary are going to be destroyed, they're not even built yet. But what he's hearing is there's going to be a command to go out, you're going to rebuild it, and then it's going to be destroyed, and then sometime after that, the Messiah will come and build his kingdom. Okay. So, what happens? Well, it turns out there is a command to go to command to restore was given. Not long after this vision that Daniel gets, Cyrus the Great defeats the Babylonian forces. He becomes the supreme ruler. He's the king of the Medo-Persian Empire. He looks very favorable beyond the Jews. Go read the book of Nehemiah, the book of Ezra. And he essentially says, I like you guys so much. Go back and rebuild Jerusalem, rebuild the temple. And there's several commands he gives. Ezra is actually charged with going back and doing part of it. Nehemiah is tasked with going back and doing part of it. And so one of the commands, which is given in Ezra chapter 1, verses 1 to 4, dates from about 537 BC, and another one is about 518 BC. It's in Ezra 6:12. But they don't really talk about the rebuilding of the city walls. They're more about the temple. So the third one we think that really is the most likely candidate actually came in 458 BC. And that's when Ezra is given a decree actually by Artaxerxes to go back and do some rebuilding and things like that. There's another one, 449. So we're not exactly sure which decree to start doing our numbering from. But in any case, those are all around 400 and some years before BC, 450 years BC. You notice anything about that chart? And 450 years would give or take some time. Well, we got this 483 years. That could be the candidate there, right? So now we're starting to see the picture of what happens. Easy for us because we can look back in history. We say, wait a minute. There's a gap between this thing and the rest of it. A gap between the first 69 weeks and the last week. This first 69 is, starts in 518 or 458 or, pick your favorite number, and it ends, well, what happens about 483 years after that? The time of Christ. And so there's a bunch of things that we could be talking about here. Could actually be talking about when Christ came, when Christ was crucified. Could also be talking about not long after the time of Christ, the Roman Emperor Titus came in and leveled. So they go back and rebuild the city and the temple. Ezra and Nehemiah lead that, and it lasts for several hundred years, and that's what's standing when we get to the time of Christ. And Christ goes to the temple. That's the version of the temple they see. We sometimes call it Herod's temple because the emperor, governor Herod, they call him King Herod, King Herod in order to buy the affection of the Jews, really built it up a lot. So we sometimes call it Herod's temple. And that was what was standing when Christ was around. You go back and read the Gospels, and it talks about that. And that was later destroyed in 70 AD. The Roman Emperor Titus came in. He was having problems with the Jews, and he was general, not quite emperor yet. He later became emperor. He comes in and wipes out Jerusalem, tears down the temple. And by the way, where's the temple today? Doesn't exist, right? That's going to be a problem here in a little bit, because we're going to see some references to the temple existing in the future. Okay? Wow. Now we're starting to see some of the things that are going to happen in the future. Okay, so nothing left to say, we see what's happening here. This is another place where they didn't see the church age. But starting at the time of Christ and continuing on today is the church age. And what's that mean? This is our big takeaway. Well, we still have that last period of 7 years hanging out to take place, right? So they got the command to rebuild. They rebuilt, came along. Christ came along. The Messiah was cut off. Sure sounds like the death of Christ, doesn't it? The city and sanctuary were destroyed. Yeah. Now we're in this church age, and what's left? Well, we have this last 7-year period that has to take place. And that's the same one of that big one that we had here, where we called the Roman Restoration, the restored Rome. So that means, let's sum it all up here, and then we got one more vision that we got to take care of. So, let's get all the timing real straight. Israel was carried away into bondage as chastisement for their sins. They were allowed to go back and rebuild, and the Messiah came the first time, but they rejected him. We went into this period that we call the church age. What's left to happen now? But God still has a whole bunch of promises out to the Jews that he's got to deliver on, including this whole idea of the Messianic kingdom and all of that. So that stuff is still future to us because we're in the middle of this church age. So here's our giant timeline. We're right dab in the middle of that church age. Well, not in the middle. We're somewhere in the midst of that church age, right? And so the next big prophetic event is what? Well, yeah, we got to get back to this restored Rome, and something's going to happen to the last week, the last 7-year period of what we just read in Daniel, leading into the Messianic kingdom. Whoa. What do we normally call that 7-year period? Well, we called it that on an earlier chart, the tribulation. And it will indeed be a period of tribulation. Questions? Everybody tracking? That's how we get this idea of a 7-year tribulation. We didn't just pull it out of the air. It comes from these prophecies in Daniel, some of which have been fulfilled and some of which are still future. When it comes to being the fulfilled stuff, we got even more because we got a whole nother vision. We still got time to cover it. Let's see if there's anything. Let's summarize all that. Oh, and also there's some questions when you talk about the 7 years. Is it 7 calendar years, 300 solar years, 365 days? Is it 360 days, which is a lunar year? And there's all sorts of questions like that. We're going to avoid all those kinds of questions. That gets down into the weeds. But the real idea is that Daniel's first 69 weeks, the first 483 years, cover the time from when the Jews returned from captivity until the time of Christ. Then we go into the church age, not explicitly shown to Daniel. Okay? And then the last week is still in the future. That's that time when God returns his focus to Israel. So we're in this period of time when I can't say God forgot Israel or that he disavowed Israel or anything like that, but his prophetic plan towards Israel is sort of on pause at this time while we go through this church age. And at some point, he's going to hit play again. And that'll be important next week when we talk about the rapture and all that kind of stuff, how we make that transition. One more vision we want to talk about. This is Daniel chapters 11 and 12. It's the last vision he has that's recorded. And you think that it was cool how he was naming names before, King of Media, Persia, the king of the Greece, and all that kind of stuff. He really gets into it now, and we're not going to read the whole thing. But he starts with basically the death of Alexander in 331. Actually, before that, he starts talking about Alexander, the king of the great, though he calls him the mighty king in the first part of chapter 11. We won't read the whole thing, but he talks about the mighty king. That's Alexander. And then he talks about the king of the north, which is Syria, and the king of the south, which is Egypt. And they have a bunch of alliances, and they fight with each other and things like that. Daniel describes it all in a lot of detail. And you can put your Bible in one hand, turn to chapter 11 and 12, and you can put your history book on the other, and you can sort of track them side by side. Now, you got to, obviously, he doesn't know names, but he doesn't call out Alexander by name, but you can see a pretty good, as a matter of fact, his description of history is so accurate that modern scholars tend to say Daniel could not have written that back in the 6th century. Instead, he must have written it after, in the late 2nd century, early or late second, around 150, after, actually, if you want to time it, actually after the Maccabean revolt, for those of you that know your Jewish history, because it's described in here. And they basically say, if you don't believe in biblical prophecy, you say there's no way he could have guessed at all of this. It must have been written afterwards, and then written, I mean, I can tell you who's going to win last year's football game, okay? It's next year's football game that we're a little bit more suspect at, and certainly the football game hundreds of years in the future, we really can't. And yet, Daniel has so well described that the modern scholars say, it can't be. And so they've said Daniel must be a fictitious character, and the book of Daniel was written sometime around 150 BC or something like that. Now, there's a problem with that theory, lots of problems with that theory. We have no evidence of that, other than the fact that Daniel was so good at giving prophecy. But the Dead Sea Scrolls, we have copies of Daniel from around the time that were stored in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So we actually have, proof that the book of Daniel was there as prophecy around the time that these guys say it was being made up. So we have evidence that he didn't make it up. It actually does come from the 6th century, and so we got to believe this. So what's he say? That's a side note. What's he say? He describes this, the comings and goings of these kings and things like that. And then he gets to a big event in history, one that every Bible person ought to know something about. And that is during this period, and it was about 167 BC. We can read what Daniel says. And in his estate shall stand up a vile person to whom they shall not give the honor of the kingdom, and he shall come in peaceably and obtain the kingdom by flattery. And he starts describing a guy that we have identified as the historical character, Antiochus Epiphanes IV. So I'll give you the short version of this story. There's a fascinating longer version, but the short version is Antiochus Epiphanes IV was one of the successors when the Greek Empire fell apart. and he was trying to fight with all the other parts of the Greek Empire and everybody else. And he was mad at the Jews. He kept going through Jerusalem, and they had a bunch of revolts going on and things like that. He was mad at them. So one time as he's going through, I forget if he was on his way to the south to fight the folks in Egypt or on the way back, I don't remember. But he goes in and he says, I'm going to take care of these Jews once and for all. And he starts mass murdering them. And the big thing he does is he goes into the temple and he sacrifices a pig. Now you can imagine, to the Jews, this is a pretty terrible thing. He desecrates, if you will, desecrates the temple by, and then sits himself down on the Ark of the Covenant there, on the glory seat, and says, I am king, worship me. And he thinks that by doing this, he'll put all the Jews in their place and they'll all humbly go away and stop bothering him. Of course, what happens? Exactly the opposite. They get into more and more of a fervent heat, and there's all sorts of revolutions. A bunch of guys named called the Maccabees start a revolt, and eventually they sort of throw off some of the Greek influence, and then when the Romans take over, the Romans inherit the problem, and that's why things are so contentious at the time of Jesus, is because you still have the residuals of all this stuff going on, and the Jews are still, looking for their Messiah and things like that, and then they reject Jesus when he comes. Well, this is all based, and Daniel describes this event hundreds of years before it happened, and he describes it in Daniel's 11 and 12, and even verses 33 and 35, he describes the and he talks about this guy Antiochus Epiphanes. And it turns out, we'll run out of time if I'm not careful, Antiochus Epiphanes is actually, he's an important historical figure, but he's a type of the Antichrist. And we start to get some hints of that. So he describes it there in verses 12 and for a while. He gets to 33 and 35 and describes the Maccabean revolt. And then he has an interesting phrase. He says, because at this point, Daniel's viewpoint shifts. He has a phrase in here, even to the end, even to the time of the end. And then he starts describing some things that don't sync up with history. And he talks about a king, and it sounds sort of like this Antiochus Epiphanes guy, but also doesn't sound like him. And talks a lot more about him, and the king shall do according to his will, and he shall exalt himself and magnify himself above every god, and shall speak marvelous things against the God of gods, and shall prosper till the indignation be accomplished. And so, and talks a lot more about him. And then continues on and talks about that king, which now we can identify, once we have Revelation and stuff, start filling in, as the Antichrist. So Antiochus Epiphanes was not the Antichrist. He was a type or a precursor to the Antichrist. And we see in this gap here, when Daniel uses that phrase, that now he's looking at the Antichrist. And he continues on, he talks about the time of troubles as never before. And talks about, in verse 12, or chapter 12, verse 1, deliverance and the resurrection. Whoa, what's all that talking about? Well, he just stepped us through this picture again, in another direction. And so, all that stuff up until he has that break where he said that phrase, until the end of time. And then we have the church age. We're still in that break. And then we get the last part. We get Daniel chapter 12 and those things that happen. And Daniel gives us some insights as to what's going on there. When we're going to have a restored time and a time of troubles. How's he phrase it? time of troubles never before seen, and then deliverance, and then resurrection. Whoa, that's a mouthful. Luckily, that's all we have in Daniel. Okay? Other than, there are some, that he actually, Daniel ends with a couple of cryptic things as well. It says, it shall for a time, times, and half a time. So he gets that phrase in again, 3.5 years is something special. When he shall have to accomplish to scatter the power of the holy people, then all these things will be finished. So we got to figure out what to do with all that. We're not getting into those details tonight. Does all that make sense? You see where we build this idea? Comes from the scriptures. It comes from primarily Daniel, but supplemented by other places, where we are now in a waiting period in God's prophetic plan. But at some time, and very possibly sometime soon, God's going to take his finger back off that pause button, and we're going to have the last 7 weeks, and then the millennial kingdom, and then go into eternity. Does it make sense? We'll look at some more details. We're not going to go through all the Revelation. There's way too much. Like I said, we mentioned last week, we're going to teach a course on this next year in KBBI, in which we're going to go into this in more detail, because there's a lot to, and it's going to take a year to do all this, because there's a lot there, but it's really meaty stuff. Why do we care? We got just a couple of minutes left. Why do we care? Why do we care about any of this stuff? Why do we bother to read Daniel? Why do we bother to read Revelation?
It's the future.
So there's one aspect of it. It's the future. Who doesn't want to know? Hey, do you want to know the future? Okay. If I told you next week's winning lottery numbers, you'd be interested, wouldn't you? Well, we got stuff a whole lot more important than next week's lottery numbers here, right? We have what's going to happen in the future. Now, some of it is near future. Some of it's a far future. I don't know what's going to happen near future. That's why I have a calendar, and then I don't, I never do what it says. But we can see in the big plan the future. Not just are we interested because we see the future, but we'll tag on to that. We see God delivering on his promises. He made promises to Israel, some of which he's already fulfilled, but some of which he still has yet to fulfill. And that's what that messianic kingdom is going to be all about. And that 7-year period is going to, we're going to figure out what's going on there, because it's going to set that up. God still has some promises he's going to deliver to Israel. And if seeing how God's going to deliver on his promises to Israel, gosh, what's that mean for us? Did God make some promises to us? Yeah. He made some future promises to us. Does that mean that God's going to fulfill those future promises? Sure thing. If that much of Daniel turned out to be true, and the rest of it we can still see coming, and that was a bunch of promises, can't God fulfill his promises to us? Promises about eternal life and things like that. And not only that, it tells us if God's faithful in delivering on his promises up at the big things, isn't God going to be faithful about his promises about the little things as well? Our day-to-day life. Not always in ways we expect. Timelines don't always, the events don't happen the way that we would have thought without God's knowledge. But we can trust that it'll come out and that God will fulfill his promises that he's made to us. Any other reasons why we care? Here's another reason. When we get into the tribulation and things like that, we run into some scary stuff. We don't have to worry about that scary stuff if you're saved. But the people around you do have to worry about that. We'll talk more about that next week as we talk about the rapture and things like that. But God also made some promises, if you would call it that that aren't good promises. Promises of vengeance, promises of destruction, promises of judgment. We want to be warning people about that. And you can see Daniel as he writes, some of it's exciting to him. The call to rebuild the city, he's been looking for that his whole life. The call for rebuild the temple and renew the nation and to be able to worship. He's excited about that, and then he realizes there's a whole lot of judgment going on here. So God delivers on his promises to his saints, even in times of tribulation. God will deliver upon his promises of judgment to others, and we need to be warning people of that. And it's also just interesting stuff to me, I think. It's a lot of, you turn on the TV and you can't help it. You know, if you scroll the channels, you'll have all sorts of wacko ideas about what the end times are going to be like, and everything from bizarre theological Christian, semi-Christian theological ideas to alien abduction and you know, all that kind of stuff. I know how it's going to end. Okay? I don't know all the details. I don't have to know all the details. But it's interesting to me to study the details, and we can be assured it'll happen the way God says. Okay? Questions? Okay? We'll wrap it up. I don't know if we have 1 week or 2 weeks left. It depends. But I'll ask you a question after we're done. But okay, are we all good? Okay, thanks, Phil.